Hello and welcome to today's webinar, 1 month post-GDPR, Experts Weigh In on the Now What. I'm Megan Winnery, Senior Demand Gen Manager at Telium, and I'll be your moderator. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar will last approximately 60 minutes and will be recorded, and the slides and the recording of the presentation will be made available at the end of the session. Please note that you'll find some related resources in the attachments and links section that you can view during or after the webinar. And we want to hear your questions, so please use the Ask a Question feature to submit them. And for any that we aren't able to get to live, we'll follow up with you after. And we'll be live tweeting with the social hashtag like and share as we live tweet throughout the webinar. All right. Now on to today's presenters. Malti Mirage is Telium's Senior Counsel with over 15 years experience in the legal landscape. In her current role, Malti supports the global sales teams and has become one of Telium's subject matter experts on data privacy, GDPR, and other compliance initiatives. Prior to this, Malti was the Director of Global Privacy and Senior Corporate Counsel at ExactTarget. Ryan Hogan is a Director of Strategic Advisory Services at AppSec Consulting and a certified privacy professional and risk management professional with more than 18 years of industry experience. He has served in key information security roles at large enterprises within the finance, technology, manufacturing, and pharmaceutical markets. Ryan has worked as an auditor reviewing security controls for SOC reports and as a security manager at a service provider that is having its security controls audited, as well as a security manager at customers reviewing the results of a service provider's security audit. He uses this experience to provide a balanced view and take a risk-based approach to information security that meets his business objectives. Okay, and for today's agenda. During today's webinar, we'll briefly walk through a few notable regulations, GDPR, EU Privacy Shield, and e-Privacy Directive and Regulation. Then we'll discuss how to stay compliant with GDPR, as well as the most common questions around consent, legitimate interest, and data sharing and storage. We'll touch on the opportunities for brands that arise from regulation, what happens when brands don't comply, and we'll finish with steps for creating and executing an ongoing privacy program. In today's session, we will be sharing our thoughts and experiences, but please note this should not be considered legal advice. All right, let's get started. Malti, over to you.
Thank you, and welcome, everyone. So I know that most of you in attendance are probably familiar with the GDPR, so we just wanted to do a brief summary. Our thought is if we understand why the GDPR was put in place, it helps us to understand the best ways to implement it within our own organization. So the GDPR is a comprehensive law that updates and replaces the national data protection laws that were in place under the old Data Protection Directive. So the GDPR, all organizations that process personal data of an EU individual is within the scope of the law, and it significantly expands the privacy right of EU individuals. Some people go so far as to describe it as a Bill of Rights for individuals. It places new obligations on organizations that handle or track EU personal data, including breach notification and enhanced security requirements. Above all, the fines under the GDPR are significant, up to 2 million or 4% of global annual turnover for more egregious violations, and up to 10 million or 2% of annual global turnover for other violations. So it not only applies to all organizations as long as you have access to EU individuals' personal data, but the fines also have global reach. And so now Ryan is going to talk a little bit about the EU Privacy Shield and how that interacts with GDPR.
Thanks, Malti. So the EU Privacy Shield is really an extension of a previous program that was called Safe Harbor. Before GDPR went into effect, there was the Data Protection Directive, or the DPD as it's commonly known, and that was the basically ruling legislation, and then individual EU member states implemented it that talked about privacy in the EU. And since the U.S. doesn't have a federal privacy law, we did not get what's called an adequacy decision for our privacy laws, because there's essentially nothing for them to look at the national level. So they implemented the Safe Harbor program, which basically said if you're a company and you enroll in the Safe Harbor program, then you agree to follow these privacy principles, and if you do that, then you're adequate and your data can be transferred from the EU to the US. Well, after the Edward Snowden revelations, a lot of people got pretty excited about it, and the EU High Court basically overturned Safe Harbor and said it was inadequate in protecting European PII, which, honestly was probably the right call. So they came up with a replacement, which is called EU Privacy Shield. So again, EU Privacy Shield is providing this legal mechanism to transfer PII from the EU to the US. It gives companies enrolled in it adequacy. Now there's some other options to get that, but that's the main thing that a lot of companies are focused on. Because it has an actual certification, they're self-certifying, but you enroll in the program with the FTC, and customers or partners can look your company up and say, yep, you're registered with EU Privacy Shield. They don't have to just take it on faith. There are some key requirements within Privacy Shield around basically following those privacy principles, and some key things like providing complaint resolution or addressing access requests within 45 days. Now, the thing to keep in mind about Privacy Shield is that it's based on this older legislation, the Data Protection Directive, or the DPD, not the GDPR. Therefore, it's likely to get revised and updated to be in closer alignment with the GDPR. So stay tuned, and that is one of the things that they reserve within the Privacy Shield program, is to make updates and require companies that are enrolled to keep up with those updates. The final piece of legislation we're going to talk about relates to a third piece of the puzzle, if you will, for EU privacy, and that's about the e-privacy directive.
So the e-privacy directive is the regime that we are currently under. In January of 2017, the European Commission published draft e-privacy regulation, and they were hoping to align with the GDPR and come into force at the same time, with the same kinds of fines and the same kinds of strictures. So like with the GDPR, the intent was to harmonize data protection laws across all EU member states and strengthen global data protection in light of technological developments and increased globalization. So the intent was very similar as with the GDPR. And as with the e-privacy directive, which is the regime that we're currently under, the regulation covers electronic communication, and it includes unsolicited marketing, cookies, and confidentiality. The trouble with the e-privacy regulation was that, there were a lot of things that are still being hotly contested. And so May 25th came and went, and we still don't have a final date being projected. Some people are thinking maybe the end of 2019 before the e-privacy regulation comes into force. But there are going to be changes that will be significant for us, especially for folks that are marketing electronically, which is, so many of us. So the e-privacy regulation is now planned for email marketing messages, and cookies, the tracking cookies are now going to be treated a little bit differently. The thing that we have so relied on since the e-privacy directive came into force, which is the pop-up cookie banners, those are likely going to go away, maybe, and they're asking for cookies to be tracked within software and within the user browser settings. And as with the GDPR, you have enhanced security and confidentiality requirements, including treating metadata differently. So, for example, the e-privacy regulation, from what we have seen of the leaked draft, is going to be requiring consent even for metadata. So this is something that, we want you to keep your eye on because it is going to significantly impact how we work as marketers. And it really sort of takes what the GDPR is saying and elaborates on the requirements regarding online and electronic communication. So as yet, there is nothing definite, but this is something that we need to keep our eyes on and always read it in combination with the GDPR. So now we're going to talk about ways. Go ahead, Ryan.
I was going to say the same thing. So now we're just going to talk about a few ways that you can help prevent some unwanted attention in light of this regulatory context for privacy. So there's really three things that we kind of use as our guiding principles for staying compliant and avoiding negative publicity. The first thing is that we want to provide a good public image regarding privacy. So we've made sure that our public-facing privacy policy shows how we're managing privacy within the company. And if you think about it, this is going to be one of the first things that should a data protection supervisory authority have any sort of questions about your company or how you are managing privacy, the first easy thing they can do is go and check what your public-facing image is around privacy. So you want to make sure that your website has an up-to-date and GDPR-compliant privacy policy. And if you have some information that you can provide about how your company is striving to maintain compliance with the GDPR, obviously that's going to give you a better image than if you have nothing or if your privacy policy was last updated in 2010 or something like that. The next thing is that you want to avoid complaints, and you want to make sure that you address subject access requests as quickly as possible. So make sure that you have a process in place to process those complaints or questions. And if you get a subject access request, whether it's anything from just, hey, what kind of data do you have on me, to I'd like to update my consent, or I want my data deleted, that you can actually respond to those requests in a timely manner and make sure that they don't get lost in the shuffle. Get sent to some email address that only gets checked once a month, and then you find out you have 2 days left to address it, and that's not enough time. So make sure that you have a good process in place to process those requests and questions. And then finally, you want to avoid security incidents. One of the new things with the GDPR is a requirement for breach notification. Previously, this was kind of all over the place and regulated by each member state. But the GDPR provides a single set of requirements around security incident notifications. So as you might imagine, if you're notifying a supervisory authority that, hey, we had a data breach and we lost some records, like say Ticketmaster UK did just recently, you're going to draw the attention of that supervisory authority. They're going to say, well, geez, how did you manage to lose this data? So you want to do whatever you can to prevent those kinds of data breaches, and then secondly, make sure that you respond to them appropriately if and when they do happen.
So we're going to talk now about things like consent, legitimate interest, and data sharing and storage. And we're going to start with consent. And so under Article 6 of the GDPR, there are 6 legal bases for processing personal data. You have performance of a contract, you have legal obligation, vital interest, which is happens in life or death situations. You have public interest, which is usually applicable only to public bodies. Legitimate interest, which Ryan will speak about in more detail in a little while, and then you have consent. And for a long time, I think a lot of us, sort of relied very heavily on consent as the legal basis for processing personal data. But keep in mind that consent is only one of the legal bases. And if it's possible for you to have another basis like legitimate interest or performance of a contract, which is what most of us will deal with, then it's better to rely on one of the other legal bases, none of which are easy, as you hear later on. But if you are relying on consent as your legal basis for processing personal data, then you have to make sure that your consent is valid. So first you have to do the analysis. Is consent what is required here? And if consent is required, then is the consent I'm obtaining valid consent? And for consent to be valid, you must have, it must be clear and affirmative, freely given, specific, unambiguous, informed, and very, very importantly, revocable or withdrawable. So you need to make sure there is genuine choice. And that is where things like practical things like using clear and plain language and keeping a clear distinction from other matters. That is, you have granularity for a different purpose. So say, for example, we obtain consent from you to use your information for providing the slides for this webinar. This does not mean that we could also market to you in the future unless we also obtain your separate consent for such purposes. You can't mix consent for various purposes and take that as valid consent. And under the GDPR, you also need explicit consent in certain circumstances. So for example, if there are serious risks to the data subject because you're processing special categories of personal data, or if you're carrying out automated decision making, those need explicit consent. And above all, as with everything GDPR, documentation is important. So documentation of the consent. You as the data controller have the burden of proof of showing that you have indeed obtained valid consent for an individual, and so the ability to document that consent becomes very important. So some things that you should avoid when you're thinking of obtaining valid consent, you avoid things like pre-checked boxes, you avoid things like bundled consent, and you avoid ambiguous or unclear information being provided in order to obtain that consent. And also one of the last things to keep in mind is that consent is not appropriate where there is a power imbalance. So for example, in an employer-employee relationship, consent is not considered to be a valid mechanism for obtaining and processing personal data because the employee is not on the same playing field as the employer. And another thing to keep in mind with respect to consent is that, remember, as we talked about before, you have to keep in mind how e-privacy interacts with the GDPR. And so even though under the GDPR, one could make the argument that marketing, for example, is a legitimate interest, under the e-privacy, you generally require opt-in for direct marketing purposes. So consent is valid. We use consent a lot at Telium for all of our marketing purposes, but there are circumstances in which in the provision of our services, we would rely, for example, on the performance of a contract. And so you always need to do that analysis. What is my legal basis for processing the personal data before you make that decision on how to move forward.
And as Malchi mentioned, there is another thing that's commonly used called legitimate interests. And when you first read it, it sounds really awesome because it's like basically if your company or organization has a legitimate interest in processing the PII, you're allowed to do so. But there is a big caveat, and that's basically you're supposed to do what's called a legitimate interest test. So the crux of the test is basically, does your company's right or to use this data for legitimate interest, for example, to make a profit or provide a service, outweigh the data subject's privacy rights? And so you have to go through this test, this balancing test, they call it, to check out and see what the answer is. And the link provided here under the ICO legitimate interest checklist will take you to a spot from the United Kingdom's Data Supervisory Authority, which is called the ICO. They have a nice checklist there where you can kind of walk through the legitimate interests and perform your own test. again, as Malte mentioned, the big thing is you do need to maintain documentation for everything associated with the GDPR. So if you decide to use legitimate interests, when you perform this test, make sure that you document your answers and results so that you can determine not only that you have a legitimate interest in using the PII in the manner described, but also that you can show it to a supervisory authority or use it in resolution of any sort of complaint. So just a couple of real-world examples for how legitimate interests could be used. The first one would be in marketing. It's actually specifically called out in one of the preambles in the GDPR that legitimate interests could be used for marketing purposes. The challenge right now, though, is that it could bump into the requirements under the e-privacy directive, which requires prior consent for direct marketing. Now, obviously, there's other kinds of marketing besides direct marketing, but that's one of the most common ones. So again, this is why we'd say make sure you keep the e-privacy directive, or eventually regulation, in mind when you're doing these kinds of legitimate interest tests for something like marketing. Another example of legitimate interest would be, let's say you're a public utility providing gas or electric to your customers, and you have EU data subjects as a part of that company. You therefore need to periodically make some sort of announcements to your customer base. For example, there's a upcoming change in rates. One of the common things is they'll say there's now peak rates. So if you use power between 2 p.m. and 7 p.m., you're going to pay a higher rate than you would the rest of the day. And the goal is just to get people to use power more wisely and reduce demand during peak periods. Well, if you're that utility and you want to inform your customer base of this upcoming change, you could do a legitimate interest saying, okay, well, we're going to use the contact information we have for these customers in order to notify them about the upcoming change. We're not going to try to gather consent, or we're not relying on something in a contract. So let's say our contract doesn't have a provision for that in there. We're going to use legitimate interest. Most likely in that case, if you weigh it out and go through the checklist, you're going to find out that, again, it shouldn't be a problem and that there is a legitimate interest in doing that. The third example would be around website analytics. A lot of us use website analytics in one way or another, from Google Analytics to something else that's just tracking how people are interacting with your website. Again, you might say that, well, we have a legitimate interest in understanding how people interact with our website, and so we don't want to gather consent just to do that type of analytics. It may be okay, it may not, but it's something where, again, you're going to have to do that legitimate interest test, but you're also going to have to consider the e-privacy directive, because e-privacy has some requirements around third-party transfer and of PII and the consent related to it. And then the last area we wanted to talk about was around essentially this idea of third-party transfer and sharing data or storing data with third parties. The key thing to remember here is that you are required to do due diligence on your vendors, and that's where a lot of our customers and clients are seeing demand or questions from their customers, where they're saying, okay, well, we'd like to understand when we provide our data to you, where else is it going, and are you doing a good job protecting it? So this is required by both the GDPR and EU Privacy Shield. And what it means is that you have to make sure that you have compliance all the way through your supply chain with GDPR requirements. And a big part of that goes on to our next slide, which is about data protection addendums. And this would be something that you add with your contracts with your partners or vendors, whoever you're sharing data with, or maybe storing data with, or some other way processing data. You want to make sure that these vendors are going to meet the GDPR requirements, and some of the key requirements there are that they're going to help you meet your privacy obligations. So if you say get a subject access request for data be removed from your systems related to an EU data subject, that you go ahead and do that, but then that wherever you're storing it, that they're also going to assist you with doing that if it's on their systems as well. And it's very important to make sure that you have this all the way through your downstream suppliers. So if your data is stored in one place and it's backed up to another, and you get this request for deletion, that request not just flows through your systems, but it also flows through your sub-processor systems. One of the key ways that organizations will show that they have some level of compliance, either with privacy and security requirements, is that they'll have some sort of third-party certifications or audits. So are they enrolled in something like EU Privacy Shield? Do they have something like a SOC 2 report for security and confidentiality, or maybe an ISO 27001 certification, or maybe even ISO 27018 certification, which is for cloud privacy. So it's worth doing the due diligence to protect yourself, and it's worth having these data protection addendums in place, again, to protect your company and to protect your customers.
So it's hard to think, when you think of the amount of work and the amount of worry associated with the GDPR, whether they are positive effects of the recent legislation. And, we at Telium tend to try to look at it that way for more than one reason. It's not easy, and we acknowledge that, but it does present opportunities for us to improve in a very comprehensive way how we're dealing with personal data. Fundamentally, there is a shift in how we view data subjects and personal data. The personal data belongs to the data subject. We're stewards, we're custodians of that data. We have an obligation to protect the data. We have an obligation to respond to any data subject access rights, for deletion, for access, for rectification. Those are all things that we need to put in place, and it makes a big difference. One of the big opportunities that it presents as well, it is ease of dealing with the EU. Instead of having individual laws from all of the different member states, all with nuances and differences that you have to keep up with, you now have one pan-European legislation with the same timing for breach notification, for example, 72 hours. The same levels of security being, required. There are some things that you need to keep in mind. So, for example, what is defined as a minor has been left up to the individual member states, and there are a couple other things that have been left to the discretion of the member states. But for the most part, it's pan-European and it's equivalent. It also gives you a great opportunity to look at your data flows and all of your policies and processing regarding personal data. And in looking at those data flows, you are able to fix any deficiency in a manner that's globally acceptable. For the most part, the thought is if you can comply with the requirements under the GDPR, you can probably comply with the requirements with a large number of other countries globally. It also takes things that have been sort of mere words in the past, privacy by design, privacy by default, security by design, data minimization. All of those things which have been mere words in the past, now you really do have to implement it. You have to think about it. And you have to think about what the consequences are. So, for example, if you have data minimization and there is a data breach, you're less likely to get in trouble. And we're thinking here of Equifax, which is what we have on the slide, but it could be any number of companies which have had very public, very terrible data breaches in the past year or two. And remember, it's not something. Security breaches are not something that's going to be minimized as time goes on. People are becoming more and more sophisticated. The technology is becoming more and more sophisticated, and so the more you could control the data you have, the more you know where that data resides, the more you know about what you're doing, the better your position to be able to handle those circumstances. So we look at the GDPR really as an opportunity to get a handle on personal data and also to put the appropriate policies and procedures in place to protect that data.
And while there's obviously some good things that come out of the GDPR, and including things that Malte just talked about, the biggest thing everybody focuses on is the fines and the fear associated with them. So we're going to talk about that next here. Some of you may be familiar with the ICO, which again is the UK's data supervisory authority. And it's one of the better funded and better run data protection authorities. They have a pretty comprehensive website with all sorts of materials and references about how to comply with GDPR or privacy in the UK. And they also have one thing that I think is kind of interesting, which I call the ICO Wall of Shame, which they basically post on this website the enforcement actions that they've taken to date. And you can see on the little snippet from the right-hand side, they break it down into things like monetary penalties, enforcement actions, and some other things. Now, so when I did a little bit of an analysis on the monetary penalties, just based on the historical actions of the ICO, I noticed a few things. First of all, they're not afraid to fine. The fines are levied under the previous data protection laws in the UK, which limited them to £500,000. But they weren't afraid to do that. And they never came quite as high as the maximum fine. But there have been a number of fines that have been levied over the years. And they will fine based on a couple of things. First of all, whether or not companies took appropriate measures to secure the PII data in their custody. And second of all, whether they collected that PII or used that PII in an appropriate manner. If there wasn't prior consent that was obtained or confidentiality wasn't properly maintained, they will go ahead and fine. And they don't care if you're a charitable organization or a government body. The most recent one, or maybe not the most recent, but a more recent one was from the Gloucestershire Police Department, got fined for about £80,000 for inadvertently and insecurely communicating abuse victims' email addresses to other people on a email distribution list. So, it wasn't an intentional fine, but it was clear carelessness, and it clearly exposed and impacted these abuse victims' lives that other people would realize, oh, well, you're one too, kind of thing. So they are, again, very active, and they do take it seriously. So that's some examples of current fines. Now, the thing that I noticed when I really studied them is that it really tends to be the egregious violations, not the little whoopsie daisies for the big fines. The largest fine that was recorded to date was £400,000, and that was for a company that was behind over almost 100 million nuisance calls. So again, this isn't like somebody accidentally forgot to get consent and made some marketing calls. We're talking almost 100 million calls. And again, you can see that they went after a charity that had inappropriately shared records. But again, it wasn't like 1,000 records or 10,000 records. It was almost 1 million records. And then for the third example, this is another large fine. One of the largest ones was £350,000. They failed to ensure that their marketing calls were basically made based on consent. And so again, it wasn't just that there was one marketing call or 10,000 or something. They had almost over 100,000 calls. Now in 2018, we haven't seen a lot of activity yet, but they still have definitely made some fines, and you can see one including the police department one I mentioned. There's a couple of more that just came up in the last few days. but they were relatively small, under 100,000 pounds in terms of the fines themselves. But the other thing that I noticed is that in most cases, before these fines were levied against these organizations, they're usually given what's called an enforcement notice, which is basically where the Data Supervisory Authority says, hey, we're not sure what you're doing is cool, please cease and desist, and talk to us about it. And if these companies persist in doing it, then the fines happen. So obviously a lesson to learn there is that if you are contacted by a data supervisory authority, engage your counsel, whether it's inside or outside counsel, and make sure that you respond in a timely manner and try to take whatever matter they're bringing to your attention seriously, because it could result in significant fines. And one of the final takeaways I wanted to point out is that in the EU, traditionally, there haven't been things like class action lawsuits or lawsuits against individuals, against companies for doing something like violating their privacy rights, but that is a new possibility under the GDPR. So not only could your company face fines from a supervisory authority, the supervisory authorities themselves have said one of the mechanisms they're relying on for enforcement is that individuals will take matters into their own hands and file things like a private right of action, which is basically a lawsuit about privacy against your company. So be sure that you're paying attention, and this is another advantage of being enrolled in something like EU Privacy Shield, because it has a complaint resolution and arbitration mechanism built within it. So maybe you could nip things in the bud by working with the person filing the complaint before it grows into something as large or egregious as a full-blown lawsuit.
So we're going to talk a little bit now about the Federal Trade Commission, and I know this is a GDPR-specific webinar, but we wanted to just remind people, especially those of us in the U.S., that we still have to be conscious of state and federal laws. So the FTC is the Federal Trade Commission, and it's the federal agency that's charged with protecting consumers and enhancing competition in the economy. And the FTC's primary legal authority comes from Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act, and that act prohibits unfair or deceptive practices in the marketplace. On top of that, the FTC has the authority to enforce other regulations, like the CAN-SPAM Act, which talks about spam in emails, the Children Online Privacy Protection Act, or COPPA, and also the TCPA, the Telemarketing and Consumer Fraud and Abuse Prevention Act. And the FTC has a number of tools at their disposal, including fines, cease and desist orders, consent decrees, and other mechanisms for enforcing violations under the Section 5. So far, what we've seen with respect to privacy is that the FTC is really going after people who might be saying something on their privacy notices and then doing something completely different. And so they're looking at that and saying, this is an example of unfair and deceptive practices, and therefore you are in violation of Section 5. So keep that in mind. Your privacy notice is critical. As Ryan talked before, you need to make sure that those are your public-facing documents, and you need to make sure they reflect your compliance with the GDPR, but you also need to make sure that they reflect accurately what your practices are, because if not, you also have to think about things like the FTC in terms of going into violation for unfair and deceptive practices.
So now that we've talked a little bit about, what are the repercussions or what do we have to do, we wanted to also just go over how you actually execute and create a good privacy program. And we'll start by just a brief overview kind of the different privacy areas. So the first one being notification. So this principle is really about letting people know how you plan to use their PII. Privacy Shield has some requirements related to both cookies and privacy policies and things that need to be in those things. And their notice is not just for the public, but also for your employees if you have EU employees. The GDPR, again, is closely related to the DPD that Privacy Shield was built on. So it has basically the same requirements, but it has some additional ones. One is that you have a concise and easy to understand notice, which can be a challenge for the lawyers. So typically what we recommend is that you have a top layer policy which summarizes what your privacy practices are, and then link to your detailed privacy policy that has been finally crafted by someone like Multi. In addition, you want to make sure that your internal employees are aware of your privacy requirements, so maybe that's getting it published in something like the employee handbook, and then linking to the employee privacy policy as well as the public privacy policy, so they're aware of their obligations, and getting them the proper training on those things. Regarding choice, the Privacy Shield requires that you gather consent appropriately and give the ability to opt out of cookies. GDPR has requirements for consent around profiling and consent for direct marketing. Profiling is basically that following people around. We'd consider it tracking typically, or maybe analytics. And the GDPR requires that we get some sort of consent before doing so. And data transfers to third parties. So when we do that, again, the Privacy Shield requires that you have those contract addendums around data protection and that you do some vendor due diligence. The GDPR has those same requirements, and then there's some additional requirements around maintaining records around those things related to due diligence, as well as the sort of processing that that vendor's doing for you. For security, Privacy Shield introduces the notion of breach response requirements and procedures. GDPR has similar things, but it actually makes it a little bit tighter. Privacy Shield is 45 days, GDPR is 30. It also talks about what they used to call them privacy impact assessments, so PIAs, you might hear the term, but under GDPR they're called data protection impact assessments. They're basically the same thing. So when you make a major change to your product, or you engage with a new vendor, or even just looking at your general company practices around data usage and privacy, you're supposed to do a risk assessment based on privacy risks to figure out, okay, are there any risks that we need to mitigate related to privacy to either protect the data or use it as required by our privacy program. There's also some requirements around, again, around training those employees for both privacy and security. You can't have privacy without security, which is how the two tie together. And again, there's some documentation requirements. Under the GDPR, the additional requirements are around having a data protection officer. This is basically somebody to head your privacy program. And they also have a requirement around privacy by design and default, which is essentially trying to make sure the default option is that the data would not be shared or would be protected by default rather than, or not gathered by default rather than the other way around. And the final requirement is around a tried and tested security program. Kind of vague language, but it's been commonly interpreted to mean something like one of those security certifications. So complying with a defined and respected security framework like SOC 2, ISO 27001, or one of the other ones. Data integrity and purpose limitation is really about making sure that you're taking good care of the data and only using it for what it's needed. In order to do that, you need to have things like a data inventory and a data flow. Now, these aren't strictly required by either the Privacy Shield or GDPR, but when you go back to the documentation, in order to show that you've done something like a data protection impact assessment when required, you're likely going to have that kind of documentation that, yeah, we know what data we have and we know what systems it flows through in order to do a good risk assessment for privacy risks. Privacy Shield also requires that you have some retention policies, and this drives right with in line with GDPR requirements that you only keep PII as long as it's needed. And maybe the final addition with the GDPR for data integrity is that you have a EU representative if you are not located in the EU. So if you're a US company doing business in Europe, they want you to have a representative in Europe, and it's basically a contact point for those supervisory authorities. And we have talked about access requests a bit. Again, these relate to everything from the right to be forgotten to deletion, various things. EU Privacy Shield basically required that that companies meet those requests, and so you need to have procedures in place. It also introduced the idea of an independent recourse mechanism. So this is a third-party service provider like JAMS or Better Business Bureau, where they would act on a complaint from a data user in the EU saying, hey, something's not being handled properly with my data and I'm not getting satisfaction. They'd go to this third party, and that, like the Better Business Bureau, would work with your organization to try to resolve the issue before it blows out of proportion. And we'd really recommend, related to access requests, that you do a tabletop exercise so that you can receive these requests and know that your capabilities exist. Because it's better for you to find out if you have some sort of gap in your ability to answer a certain type of access request than to find out the hard way when you're trying to answer one and you're on day 28 and you still haven't completed the request. And it's noteworthy that under the GDPR, there's some new data rights and access requests that can be made. One of them is around portability of data, and another one is around restriction of data. So make sure that you can meet those additional requirements. You know, automation isn't required for these things, so our general recommendation when we talk to clients is, you know, make sure that you have the process nailed and can do it manually, and then when the volume gets high enough, then you can revert to automation, because you can't automate a bad process. So you want to automate a good working process. And again, you can do that kind of tabletop exercise to verify that those things are being done appropriately. A final point I'd make is just that a lot of these things, as you probably noticed, aren't something that you just do once and you're done. They're ongoing activities. For example, the data protection impact assessments. You're going to want to keep assessing your risks related to privacy as there's changes within your business and your organization, and frankly within regulations in the world. So maybe new technological threats emerge or new regulations emerge that you're going to want to make sure that you consider.
So that's a lot that Ryan just expanded on, and the question becomes, well, how do you prioritize all of this, because it's just so many things that we need to be keeping on top of. So we were thinking about this, and we thought we sort of break it down into 4 buckets. And first thing, we thought, you know, make sure all of your public-facing GDPR compliance efforts are in place. So for example, your privacy notice, make sure you have a layered privacy notice so that is clear and well-written and easy to understand. Make sure that if you have sub-processors, downstream processors of personal data, that you name those entities as well and be very transparent about that. For right now, cookie banners are still okay as the privacy directive, but as I talked about earlier, you know, keep an eye on this space because that might change. And if you are, if you're not a EU entity, but you are marketing to EU individuals, make sure that you name both your DPO, your Data Protection Officer, if your analysis shows that you need to have one, and also that you name your EU representative on that web page. So it's right there. Everything that a supervisory authority is apt to look at is there, and it's clear and it's easy to access. Same with a data subject, right? If somebody wants information about what you're doing with their data, it's there and available. So that's the foreground work. In the background, though, you have to be doing a lot of other heavy lifting. So, for example, you have to have a mechanism for dealing with complaints, whether it's, prevention, privacy shield, as Ryan talked about, an automated way to handle data subject access requests. And always you need to test your systems. You need to conduct tabletop tests. And again, you're probably going to get tired of me saying that, but document, document, document. If you conduct a table test exercise, make sure you write up what your results are so that you have those as your documentation. Have a way to make sure that you can comply with data breach notification and security incidents. So not only do you look at things like the SOC 2 or the ISO 27001 to show that you do in fact have the appropriate technical and organizational measures in place from a security point of view, but that you conduct tabletop exercises to make sure that you are indeed doing what you say you're doing and have a mechanism for data breach notification. And with respect to downstream vendors, remember, you as the data controller, it's imperative that you know what is happening with that data. So putting in place data protection agreements and making sure by whatever vendor due diligence you need to do, whether it's on-site audits or making sure that your vendors have appropriate security certifications in place, that you conduct those as well. So what do you need to do? So we put together a quick slide that you can take a look and keep in your back pocket with what the actions are and what the deliverables are. So this, again, pretty much summarizing what we've talked about, that you compare your requirements, you determine what is your legal mechanism for transfer if you're transferring data from the EU to the US. We have not been found to have a finding of adequacy under the EU Commission, and so you have to have a valid mechanism for transfer, whether you opt for privacy shield, whether you opt for standard contractual clauses or binding corporate rules. That's a decision that you have to make as a company. And then figure out who has your personal data, and that involves data inventories, data flows, vendor analysis, data flow mapping, and then do all of the things that you need to do to limit your exposure and be ready to respond to data subject access requests and any complaints. Ryan is going to take you through some of the additional resources that we look at often and which you would find to be invaluable as you work towards your own GDPR compliance.
Thanks, Malti. So the IAPP is the International Association of Privacy Professionals. They've got a number of tools, articles, and analysis that you can use. They also provide training and certification that can be really helpful in understanding certain privacy issues. And again, it's international, so it's not just EU. It also has US resources as well. There was the Article 29 Working Party, which was the, I guess the privacy authority for Europe in the past, and their name has recently changed under the GDPR to the European Data Protection Board. But they've provided a number of FAQs and guidelines that, again, if you have a specific question around something like, do I need a data protection officer, they can help answer. The individual data supervisory authorities in various countries can help you as well. So if you have your European headquarters in the United Kingdom, I definitely recommend using the ICO website. If you're in France, CNIL has a number of templates and things that you can use. Some of them are available in both English and French. And the DPC in Ireland has a number of white papers that can help you get your arms around GDPR.
We also rely a lot on law firms, not only just because, for those that we've engaged for additional questions on privacy, but because a lot of law firms have really good information in their blogs, in their presentation, but also just look at what law firms are doing with their own privacy notices. You can see, for example, how they lay out. Some of them have really well-written privacy notices that show, I'm collecting this type of data for you, and I'm using it under this legal basis. And it really gives you an idea framing your own privacy notices and privacy practices, kind of taking advantage of the fact that, the law firms probably have hundreds of attorneys just focus on that. And so it's really good. We've named Baker McKenzie here, but we have also used other law firms as well. Take a look at them. A lot of law firms are also doing things like webinars and presentations. Take advantage of those because they really help to answer some of your questions. And we at Telium also, we try to work. I mean, we've been getting ourselves ready for GDPR for at least a couple of years, but we also are very aware that our customers look to us for guidance. And so keep an eye on the Telium.com website. We have a number of resources there available for people as well to help them as you are sort of going through this GDPR and post-GDPR world that we live in.
All right, thank you, Multi and Ryan. Right now we have a little bit of time for some questions, so let's take a few. If you want to submit your questions, please use the Ask a Question feature, and we'll start going through them. All right, so the first question seems to be about the EU copyright law. So what about the proposed EU copyright law that will be voted on next month? Do you have any sort of insight on that?
I have just a little bit of insight. I think it right now, from what we're seeing, especially with some of the articles in there, to me, it's really very confusing, and it really has us, our view of what we're going to do on the internet and what we're going to be doing in the web space very, very difficult. And now I know that they are looking to vote on it on June 20th, but I do know that there is still a lot of questions out there, and there is still a process to go through. So after the vote, they'll then have a vote in the plenary sessions with the rest of the parliament. And so, we still have to look at that space because it hasn't been finalized yet. But I do know that a lot of folks are talking against it. And there are a lot of people who are saying, actually saying, from a practical point of view, a lot of this is not going to be workable. And so I think this is another one, like the e-privacy regulation, where we have to keep an eye on it and try to figure out, what happens as the law comes closer to finalization.
Thanks, Chelsea. All right, next question. Can you give a use case or scenario of when a customer would request right to be forgotten, and what type of data would need to be removed?
Sure. A right to be forgotten request would typically come in, again, through your whatever mechanism you've set up for that, whether it's a web form or an email address. Somebody says, I would like my data removed from your systems. This happens routinely. So you have to look at the requirements under the GDPR. Look at again, this goes back to having that data inventory and data flow, so you know where that data resides. Let's say it's a contact that you are doing sales and marketing. They're not a current customer, they're a prospective customer. So you have them in Salesforce, maybe you have them in something like Marketo as well. Maybe you have them in BrightTalk. And so you go through those systems and you either delete the record in its entirety or you delete the selected fields. Again, it goes back to what data are you collecting in the first place. And the definition of PII is pretty broad under the GDPR. It's identifiable or identified information. So usernames, passwords, obviously their contact information. But again, it just kind of depends what data you're collecting. But if you've gone ahead and done your analysis in your data inventory, you'll already know what you're collecting, and when you get that deletion request, you'll know what you need to remove. And if you've done your tabletop test, which is basically a dry run of this exercise, you'll have determined, well, is it easier just to delete the whole record for this contact in Salesforce, or is it easier to delete selected fields and essentially anonymize the record? That will be a question we'll have to answer.
Great. Well, it looks like we're out of time. I wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining us, and thank you, Ryan and Malte, and we look forward to speaking with you soon. Have a great day.